Good morning. You're still on oath.
Professor Franklin, we were discussing yesterday the advice and information that was or was not made available to non-reference centre directors such as yourself. There's one further document I wanted to ask you to look at. It's CBLA 5043_040, please, Henry. This is a letter that was dated 9th of May 1983. It was sent by Dr. Spence Galbraith, who was a director of the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre of the Public Health Laboratory Service in Colindale. And you'll see there his recommendation to the Department of Health was set out in the second paragraph. All blood products made from blood donated in the USA after 1978 should be withdrawn from use until the risk of AIDS transmission by these products has been clarified. And then there's a paper in which he sets out his reasons. We just turn to the next page, please, Henry. And we can see there and on the following page his reasons. Now, I know this has been sent to you in advance of your evidence this week. Was this a document that, or a recommendation that you were aware of at the time?
No, not at all.
Do you think that as the director of a large non-reference centre, this is information that should have been shared with you at the time?
Well, it certainly should have been shared with more people than it probably was shared with. It would have been helpful. I think I would probably agree with Mark Winter that this letter should have led to some form of high-level advice to haemophilia doctors, whether sending it direct to each one with the usual rider that each director must come to his own conclusion would have been not terribly helpful. But yeah, I mean, I think this sort of spells out things very clearly. I wasn't terribly clear what actually had happened to this at all, but there was a meeting of the Committee on Safety of Medicines, I think, 2 or 3 months afterwards.
Yes, 13th of July.
I'm not even sure that meeting referenced this letter, but I think that meeting must have been, in some respects, Dr. Galbraith's answer, which was that nothing could be done on grounds of supply. Sorry, I'll paraphrase, but
yes, you're right that the issue certainly was considered at that meeting. And so the material may have been known to Professor Bloom, for example, and Dr. Krask.
Yeah.
But you, as a centre director, you never became aware at the time that
No.
the leading public health facility was making this recommendation.
No, I think I first heard this about this letter from evidence on the Tainted Blood website, I think.
I want to turn then to what was or wasn't done locally in Birmingham and the West Midlands region in response to the risk of AIDS. So if we'll go back to the regional working party meetings. If we start with the meeting in June 1983, SHIN 5030. And this, of course, is the meeting. We've already looked at it, but it's before you became director. And so you weren't in attendance at the meeting. But if we go on to the second page, and we looked at this when we were discussing the contracting arrangements, Professor Franklin, under the heading regional contract and the 3 points there. If we could just look down the bottom of the page, please, Henry. We can see there's reference made in the penultimate paragraph to Dr. Arla's making the point that cryoprecipitate was probably a safer product. Dr. Arla asking the working party to advise on heat-treated factor VIII, so this is June 1983, and then a discussion about more information being required, if we go to the bottom of the page, Henry, and 2 papers being produced, and then we can see those papers referred to at the top of the next page. At points 1 and 2, and then it said that the item will be put on the next agenda. Would you agree that the minutes of that meeting suggest that there was to be no change of approach to the treatment of patients in light of the risk of AIDS at that stage?
Probably not. I mean, I think the real crux of these decisions really swung around what the efforts were being made towards self-sufficiency. And again, I think that if I jump forward to Dr. Chisholm's comments in the next year.
It was later the same year.
Oh, later the same year. Thank you. It was quite clear that different regions had different policies on sending plasma to BPL. You read between the lines that, because if Wessex was producing unlimited, it couldn't be unlimited, but lots of cryoprecipitate, then they couldn't have been sending plasma to BPL and couldn't have been sending NHS product, getting NHS product back. And I think that really describes the reasons why the whole self-sufficiency project failed, because there was no central management. It was all left to individual regional transfusion directors, admirable in their own rights, but they would have different priorities. So had my colleagues at that time decided to switch to cryo, then we would have got less NHS factor 8. And yet we would definitely have had a shortfall on total units, I think, and would have still needed to import to make that up, even for basic home treatment regime, I would think. So I think to switch from factor concentrate to cryo would have really needed some sort of national push to say that that's what needs to be done, because otherwise you're just going to be creating holes in supply elsewhere, and you'd have some regions continuing to have lots of factor 8 concentrate and others not. I know you're hearing from Dr. Vivian Mitchell from Leicester, who I think did use a lot more cryo. So some people did make that decision. But I think this shows that in Birmingham the feeling was to carry on, but probably to carry on in the hope that we would eventually get more NHS material.
And if we move to, again, we've looked at the minutes, but just for this purpose, to the following two meetings, which are during your tenure as director. The first is SHIN 5029, please, Henry. This is the meeting that you attended, so it's your first attendance at the West Midlands Regional Health Authority Working Party meeting. We can see, if we look down the page, that the issue that was flagged up in that previous meeting doesn't really appear to have been discussed on the agenda. So if we just go further down, please, Henry, we can see, and we already looked at the reference to regional contract, so no change envisaged to the contracting arrangements. It's going to continue being ARMA. And then we can see there's a discussion at the bottom of the page about supplies from Elstree being maintained on a pro rata basis relating to the amount of plasma sent. We can see it's suggested that the volume of plasma sent could be increased, which presumably could have generated either more cryoprecipitate or more NHS factor 8. But that would mean an increased investment in the cost of bags. And then over the page, there's then a discussion about how supplies of BPL factor 8 will go to individual centres. So would you agree that there's nothing further here in terms of any change of approach to treatment being discussed at a regional level?
No, there doesn't seem to be. No.
And then the third meeting during this 1983-1984 period is SHIN 5028. So this is the 14th of May 1984. You're not in attendance. You've sent your apologies, but this is during your directorship. Yeah. And again, if we go down the page, we can see there's the usual heading of supplies of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried factor 8, but that's just an update about supplies from BPL having reached their optimum. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, and we certainly looked at this yesterday morning, Dr. Hill has given figures for the region which show an increase in the usage of BPL and a decrease in commercial factor 8. And then if we go over the page, again, we looked at this yesterday, but this shows that there may be a shortfall of BPL product, and that's going to be made up from commercial sources. And then it's the same criteria for looking at the contract for commercial factor 8, including point 3, resisting any public pressure for a change of products. So it would appear from this that as at May 1984, there's still no change within the region to the approach to treatment being discussed.
No, I don't think so. I just wonder whether, as you point out, I wasn't at this meeting, and maybe I didn't read the minutes carefully enough before I wrote. Oh no, I think my letter to Dr. Lane was a year or so later about the supply going up and down, because there was clearly some changes in supply. But
could we just go back to the page before? And where it deals under 84.3c, supplies of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried factor 8. What caught my eye was Dr. Heller's report that the new plant at BPL would be operative in 1987-88. Now this is halfway through 1984. Roughly when, during 1983 and 1984, was it expected by you or your colleagues, do you know, that the new plant would become online, on stream?
I don't have any recollection from that time as to when it would. No, don't know.
Well, thank you very much.
So, Professor Franklin, that's what the minutes show. We'll get to December 1984 when there was a new treatment policy discussed in a moment. But just looking at the period 1983 to 1984, as far as you're aware, until December 1984, were there any measures taken in the Birmingham or West Midlands area in response to the risk of AIDS?
No, I don't recall any new measures now, other than maintaining batch dedication.
And you've discussed what might have been the consequences of an increased use of cryoprecipitate in terms of a knock-on effect on supplies of NHS factor concentrate. Can you recall whether you and Professor Hill ever actually discussed the possibility of any kind of either complete or partial reversion to cryoprecipitate during that time?
I don't think I do from then. I think there was the time when we the switch over to heat treatment and the removal of the BPL product completely. We did then. Yeah.
Well, we'll move on to that in just a moment. Do you recall whether there was any discussion or consideration of something like the increased use of porcine products, for example?
No, I definitely don't remember any discussion about that other than for inhibitor patients.
So if we come on then to December 1984, Henry, that's SHIN 5026_002. This was an extraordinary meeting held on the 17th of December. It's not, the year's not given, but it is clear from the discussion that it must be 1984. And you're present, Dr. Hill's present, and we can see it says under the list of attendees and apologies, it was a meeting to discuss the implication of the use of factor 8 concentrate in light of the death of 2 haemophiliacs from AIDS. And in the next paragraph, there's an acceptance that the use of factor 8 concentrate was associated with the risk of transfusing the AIDS virus, and there's further discussion in relation to that. And then we can see it's recorded that it was considered imperative that heat-treated factor 8 should be made available to haemophiliacs as a matter of urgency. Unfortunately, the chairman informed the committee that this was unlikely to occur with NHS Factor 8 until the 1st of April 85, but that Armour heat-treated material would be available in January 85. Following discussion, a treatment policy to cover the interim period was agreed upon. And then we can see that policy. It was DDAVP or cry precipitate for mildly affected haemophilia A and
we're missing it on the screen.
I'm so sorry.
There we are.
The numbered paragraphs towards the bottom of the page. So DDAVP or cryo for mildly affected haemophilia A and von Willebrand's patients. Newly diagnosed severe haemophiliacs to be managed wholly on cryoprecipitate. Patients with no previous exposure to commercial factor 8 should continue on NHS factor 8. And if we go over the page, patients with previous exposure to commercial factor 8 should continue on NHS factor 8 if available and heat-treated commercial factor 8 when not. So it would appear that this is the first change to treatment policy that takes place in response to the risk of AIDS. Is that a fair comment from what you've read?
Well, I think so.
Professor Frank, I think you'd asked for a document to be located for you, which is from September 1984. Is that a document you particularly wanted to
Not really.
comment on?
I mean, actually, having seen it, I don't think... I mean, I think it was a useful document at the time for the doctors who used particular batches of factor 8 described in that document. But I don't... It turned out not to be as interesting as I thought it might have been.
So that there's no mystery said.
Yeah.
Professor Franklin had asked to be given a copy of... it's a report from Dr. Krask, dated the 10th of September 1984, showing... investigation in relation to patients who received the same batches of blood products as the Cardiff and Bristol cases, but we don't need to refer to it.
Yeah, I thought in the minute, I was a bit dissatisfied with the level of detail in the minute, and I wondered if that was corrected by the appendix, but I didn't think it was really.
Now, as I understand your evidence, there was a period then in the late 1984 or early 1985 period where you didn't have enough heat-treated products to fully implement the policy.
Well, my recollection of timing is probably helped by the occasion when I negotiated some extra factor 8, heated factor 8 from Armour, and that must have been the period when we were really, really short, yeah.
And what you've said in your statement is that as a response to this shortfall, there had to be a suspension of home treatment.
That's
for a
my
period of
recollection.
time. And then if we look, please, at the meeting that followed this December meeting, it's SHIN 5025, please, Henry. So we can see this is the 15th of February 1985. Again, you're in attendance. And if we just go down under the heading Supply of Factor 8, we can see there that Dr. Aller had reported that a supply of heat-treated factor 8 had been negotiated with Armour, but initially there'd been a shortfall in early January, which had now been rectified, and then currently no NHS product available, but there was potentially going to be some supply on a named patient basis and increased supplies after April 85. Does that accord with your recollection of those events?
Yeah.
Can you recall what, if any, steps were taken for patients on home treatment in this December 1984, early 1985 period to recall or ask them to bring back in any supplies they held of unheated factor products? Was that undertaken?
I can't remember whether that was the occasion when Dr. Hill and the nurse conducted a complete recall. We did call back all of the home treatment because we were suspending home treatment. We called back what was out in the people's homes. Excuse me. Because we didn't have enough in the centre to treat acute bleeds, so we had to bring the stuff back in. I can't remember whether that was used on people with acute bleeds. I saw a paper, I think yesterday, that mentioned that one of the companies was offering to heat, might have been Armour, to heat untreated product at 4p a unit. So we may have sent it back to them for heating, but I don't recall.
We know that there were patients at the Children's Hospital who were infected with HIV and seroconverted whilst receiving the Armour heat-treated product in the course of the months that followed. Did that happen, to your knowledge, with any of the patients at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
I don't remember that being the case, and I think I would have done. That was quite, well, obviously for the boys it was desperate, but I mean it was a huge deal at the time, and my recollection was that we then had to withdraw all the Armour product, and we had another acute shortage, and my recollection was that we got some support from Alpha at that time to tide us over while presumably new regional contracts were dealt with.
Yesterday I'd been about to ask you about a passage in your witness statement which I couldn't find, and I've found it now. So if we go to your witness statement, it's WITN 4032001, please, Henry. And if we go to the bottom of page 11, last sentence, you say, and this is in the context of a question about your interactions generally with Professor Hill. You say, when HIV/AIDS became a clinical issue, as co-directors we discussed our approach and reached agreement. What's that a reference to, and what period of time is that a reference to?
I'm not too sure specifically, to be honest. We would obviously be very concerned about the product safety, as I say, and we would have discussed what to do. It's possible that that might have meant no change, but we would have discussed what to do.
For the sake of completeness in terms of treatment policy, can we just go to UBFT 0000263? This is a document headed Current Treatment Policy for Bleeding Disorders, and if we go to the second page, we can see it's authored by you and it's dated the 7th of January 1986. We don't need to go to the detail of it by this point, and leaving aside obviously the issue about seroconversion on heat-treated products. You have, but I think both commercial and NHS heat-treated products in principle available to you.
Yeah.
This is the first document, I think, of this kind that we've seen. As far as you can recall, is this the first time you put pen to paper to produce a written treatment policy?
I really couldn't say one way or the other, I'm sorry.
And then if we just go to the 1986 returns for the Queen Elizabeth to see what products were being used then during that year, it's at HCDO 40373_003, please, Henry. We can see here the numbers treated. This is the haemophilia A and carriers of haemophilia A and von Willebrand's patients. So 87 haemophilia A patients, 9 von Willebrand's, no carriers treated. And we can see here, in the course of 1986, you've used a very small amount of cryoprecipitate in hospital, NHS factor concentrate, presumably by this time heat treated, and then Alpha and Armour, with the bulk of it still being Armour. The Alpha, is that potentially because of the issue that you've described?
Well, I do remember them helping us out because when the Armour, well, as you've shown, the regional contract was almost exclusively with Armour for commercial. So when the product was withdrawn, we didn't have any. So I remember Alpha helping us out, but this is more, this looks like rather more than helping out. This looks a bit more of a significant part of the contract. Almost the same as the NHS, isn't it? Oh, 80%.
Can I just move to ask you now about what information should have been and what information was, as far as you recall, given to patients? First of all, do you accept that patients should, at least by autumn of 1983, when you became director and responsible for the centre at Queen Elizabeth, should have been being warned of the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis? Yes, I do. And I think, well, whether warning is the right word. Informed.
Sorry?
Informed,
absolutely. No, absolutely. And I believe they were. I mean, as I said in my statement, we didn't have new patients with certainly not severe haemophilia. Most of them had abnormal liver function tests, and my recollection is that was discussed with them at clinic. I would add that the issue of HIV, it wasn't called that then, AIDS, became very dominant really immediately. I started doing the clinic, so I would have to admit that it probably wasn't a major component of the discussion. Most of the discussion was concerns about AIDS.
I think if we look at your witness statement, Henry, so back to WITN 40320001, please. And if we go to page 29, the top paragraph is talking about the undertaking of liver function tests. And you say we would have been looking for evidence of clinical liver disease. And then you say this: results would have been explained in general terms, better or worse, mild changes. Unlikely that precise numerical results were provided. I believe I would have done so if asked. Advice about alcohol use was provided. So that's your evidence about the kind of information that might have been given about liver tests, liver function tests. As far as you can recall, would you have used the term non-A, non-B hepatitis to patients or told them in terms that you believed or suspected that they had non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I think the answer is yes, but probably not to everybody.
What would the criteria have been as to the circumstances in which you would have?
I don't know. I mean, it would have been in general discussion.
And what, if anything, would you expect to have documented in notes? If there'd been a discussion about non-A, non-B hepatitis specifically, would that?
Well, I would have expected to have written down what the liver tests were, and that we discussed them. I think that's about it. I mean, I think there is a bit more than just doing the tests, which I didn't put in there. Obviously, one examines patients. When the men were coming up, most of them had problems with joints, so you would check the joints, see how their previous problems were getting on, and take the opportunity to examine them for evidence of, at this time, probably just liver disease. There were skin signs, various other. You'd examine the abdomen, so you would look for evidence of clinical liver disease rather than just the abnormal tests. Obviously, later on, one would be looking for evidence of immune deficiency as well, but not probably immediately after I started.
Do you accept that patients should have been informed of the risks of AIDS? I'm talking now of the period 1983-1984, by the time you're director.
Well, yes. I mean, telling people that there's a risk of implies that you're about to do something to expose them to that risk, and unfortunately, as we know, they already were exposed. So I think the main discussion was around what the actual risk was.
again, would that have been something that, in an individual patient's case, if you'd had a discussion, would be documented in their notes?
Probably not always.
In what circumstances would a discussion about AIDS have arisen? I think we see from, I think it's your letter to Dr. Lane, you talk about patients expressing worries to you. Let's check that. Yes, so by May of 1984, in your letter to Dr. Lane, you're talking about, well, let's just look it up and put it up on screen again.
Yeah.
BPLL 40853_002. You say halfway down this page, and in this letter, the 24th of May 84, almost every adult patient at our clinic asks about this syndrome, and a significant number of patients have requested to receive only NHS material. And then you say our efforts to reassure patients. Can you recall whether you had conversations about AIDS only with patients who raised it, or was it something you raised of your own initiative?
Well, it does say almost every adult patient, so perhaps there were some who didn't, but did I raise it? I can't remember really.
And the phrase "our efforts to reassure" might suggest that you were trying to reassure patients not to be too worried about this.
Well, reassurance is a word that comes up frequently from that era, doesn't it? The information we were getting from the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation was to carry on using the treatment, that it was highly unlikely that many people would get AIDS. All these things were wrong, but that was what was coming out, and that was what seemed to me to be the message. I think the true likelihood of getting AIDS from someone who was HTLV3 positive couldn't have been anticipated at that time. Maybe the worst possible scenario. We now know that everybody, other than a tiny number of people who have an unusual chemokine gene, will get AIDS from HIV, and I don't think that was known then. Reassurance is, you can say reassurance is a sort of panacea and go away and don't worry your head about it, but I think there are other meanings. I think when we were getting the positive tests back, I think there is still a role for reassurance in trying to let people know that we will continue to look after them. Mark Winter mentioned patients who have been felt abandoned, and I think we did reassure them that we would be continuing to look after them and deal with the issues. But yeah, it's a word that can be make it sound as if you're just trying to fob people off.
Let's come on then to the testing arrangements. So testing the patients at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for HTLV3. Your statement and your evidence to the Archer inquiry indicated you thought that testing began in the early part of 1985. Yeah,
I've got evidence that we started certainly in January. I don't think before that.
And the tests that were undertaken for your patients were by East Birmingham Hospital, is that right?
Yeah, well, they went to the Regional Virus Laboratory, which I think was part of the Public Health Laboratory Service. I don't know why we didn't use TEDA at the Middlesex, or, as was in the paper that came out, or Philip Mortimer at the London PHLS. I can't believe we didn't ask them, and possibly we were referred to the PHLS in Birmingham. But yeah, that was where it went.
And you described in your evidence to Archer test results coming back with a stamp on them about research purposes.
They did.
first of all, were you undertaking any research?
Well, no, I didn't consider it to be research, and in fact, I've looked, if I may,
Yes.
When this was happening, where are we? Well, at the Haemophilia Reference Centre Director meeting in September of 1984, which is HCDO 0000416, Dr. Kraus mentioned that he was offering to arrange for HTLV3 testing on samples from haemophilia centres if the haemophilia centre directors would like him to organise this for him. And that obviously happened because Jeff Savage arranged for his patients to be tested, and he included Mark Winter in that. In the December meeting of the same group, which is HCDO 0000394_117, Dr. Kraus advised that currently the reagents are only available on a research basis, and that substantial resources will be required to enable the proposed workload to be undertaken. So I think what was going on in 84 was, you could argue it was research, but they were testing reference centre patients were being tested. And we've heard some of those were told, Mark Winters were told, and others were done on frozen samples. So I'm making the assumption that the East Birmingham laboratory was using these research reagents. It was an unlicensed test, and that's why they stamped them. But I wasn't doing research. I was trying to find out what was happening.
Now, do you recall any discussions between you and Professor Hill about how to go about the process of arranging for tests?
Well, I do. And they seem to differ a little bit from what appeared to happen at the Children's Hospital. But, I didn't have samples stored or frozen on the adult patients. Or if any were, I didn't know where they were. I didn't have them. The arrangement was to ask them to come up or to see them in clinic when they were coming up, ask them if they wanted the test, take the blood and send it off. And I think I've said in my statement, nearly all of the men accepted to have the test. There were a few, I remember, who asked to leave it for a while, but I think eventually everybody was tested. The samples then went off. They took ages to come back, and I've evidence in one case it was up to 5 or 6 weeks. And then they came back with these stickers on. And so then we had to give the results, and the plan was, which was, I would say, in the vast majority was kept to, that we would tell them in the clinic. It would be me or Dr. Hill that would do that, somebody who, goodness knows, we didn't know a lot about AIDS, but somebody who was best able to impart the news rather than a junior doctor. We agreed not to send out letters and not to do it over the telephone, and to try not to do it when patients came up ad hoc with bleeds on the ward, in the clinic area on the ward room. And the reason for that was that people would come up where they may be unprepared, and also we didn't want junior doctors being given the responsibility of imparting the news, and not the nurse either. So a few men who just didn't come to clinic for whatever reason had to be told on the ward, and my recollection, that was by me. So that was the plan, and I think it was the right plan, but it took too long. And I apologise that Archer, that some men had to wait too long to get the results.
You've, if we just take it step by step, first of all, we've evidence to suggest that at the Children's Hospital there was testing on stored samples. You don't think that was the case at
I don't
Queen
remember
Elizabeth?
doing that, and I think the fact that we didn't do a great job time-wise suggests that. If I'd had a load of samples in the fridge, we would have had the answers very quickly.
Can I just ask you to look at one document which talks about stored samples? It's a later document. It's MRCO 40422_134.
Yeah, I know that one.
This is a document from the later part of the 1980s. If we go to page 3, please, Henry. We just zoom in. This is about a particular research product, but it says we collaborate on this. This is 5 lines down, with Dr. Hill and Dr. Franklin, who hold a series of sera of haemophiliacs prospectively collected since 1981 and have access to specimens of spouses of haemophiliacs. So that's what this document says.
Yeah, I was shocked when I read that.
As far as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital is concerned, are you aware of a practice of having collected sera samples from 1981? No. Do you know what the reference to access to specimens of spouses of haemophiliacs refers to?
No, I don't. I remember I think there were 4 partners, female partners of men, and they were referred to the East Birmingham Infectious Diseases Unit for follow-up of their HIV disease. We would have taken that sample initially from our clinic. I didn't keep any samples from them. The regional virus lab would have done. They used to keep samples, I don't know how long for, because the process, nowadays we have polymerase chain reaction, all sorts of antigen tests. If you going back into the early 80s, nearly all of virology was antibody testing. And the virologists wanted to look at changes in the antibody. So most people are familiar with COVID nowadays, that COVID antibodies seem to be falling away. So diagnosing viral infections back then relied on showing that the antibody was increasing, and therefore the person was infected, not particularly with HIV, but for others. So they did keep samples. No, I didn't have access to samples, and I didn't have access to the ladies either.
And then in terms of patients' knowledge of the test being undertaken, we just look at what you told Archer, and then I'll ask you about that. So if we could have, please, on screen, first of all, ARCH 40443. If we look towards the bottom of the page, sorry, if we go to the next page, my apologies, Henry. Last 2 paragraphs. So this was your written statement. You said, testing of patients for AIDS has been a very controversial area. It's clear now that some formal consent should have been obtained. However, that was not the medical policy in the early 1980s, and not only in haemophilia care. And then you refer to what happened at a clinic in a London hospital, and you quote from a book about AIDS. And then you say, this concurs with my recollection of my own practice. The regional virology laboratory offered a test in early 85. I've had cited papers suggesting we collected blood for such a test as early as January 85. And then you say you don't think that you were testing in 1984. I do not think that we tested stored samples. We go to the next page. My recollection is that specific blood samples were taken, but specific consent was not always obtained, and consent certainly not recorded. I believe that the reason for taking the samples was discussed with the patient, and then you go on to talk about the test results coming back. If we just then look at your oral evidence to Archer, that's ARCH 608, please, Henry. And could we go to, should be page 16, I think. Next page, please. If we pick it up towards the bottom of the page, so you've discussed the quote from the Garfield book earlier on, and then you say at the bottom of the page, my recollection is that there's a regional virus laboratory, and this started to offer a test sometime in early 1985. It's possible this could have been a bit earlier. I don't think we were testing before that. And then you say, as far as I can recall, we did not test stored samples, as again Garfield suggests, for another haemophilia centre. I cannot be entirely certain, but I'm reasonably confident that we didn't do that. My recollection is that we did take specific samples and that the reasons that they were being taken was discussed or mentioned, but certainly consent, formal consent as we would know it in the 21st century, was not done. Can I ask you just to elaborate upon that, really? You're suggesting, I think, in your evidence to Archer, that something would have been said to patients
Definitely,
about the taking of the sample, but you distinguish it from being consent in the way in which it would be understood in modern times.
We certainly didn't ask the men to sign anything. But my recollection and belief is that they were all told. I think my hesitation about the stored samples has perhaps been slightly answered by some of the evidence that you presented yesterday morning, is that I did have this sense that maybe Frank Hill had some stored samples, not on the adults, but perhaps on the others. So I felt that it was probably wise to leave a little bit of room in there, perhaps. I really don't remember sending any stored samples. I don't remember having a store of them. So I'm pretty confident that the adult patients that I looked after and saw were not tested on stored samples, and that they were told what the test was for. As it says there, right at the beginning, quite what that was going to mean. We didn't know it was going to mean they were all going to get AIDS, but and it was recognised that the test was a big deal. There was already issues from the USA that people with AIDS, not necessarily tested or otherwise, but people who had AIDS were being discriminated against. So, you know, it's known to be a serious issue. My recollection, it's not in here, but I think we had to tick a box saying that the person had been told. It's not exactly consent, is it? But it's, I think the laboratory required some notification that the person had agreed to have the test.
Because the terms in which you describe it here, the reasons that's the samples are being taken, was discussed or mentioned. So there might be quite a difference between discussing something and the depth of discussion and mentioning something which is potentially a briefer or more casual reference. Do you have any clearer recollection of what you think you did say to patients about this issue at the time?
No, I'll be speculating, but I'm sure I was saying that there was this test for this agent that might be associated with AIDS.
Do you know whether that would have been recorded routinely in notes?
You might like to hope so. Am I getting the impression that there aren't any notes left?
There are notes for some patients and not others,
okay.
I think.
I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult, but obviously, were there notes, it would be useful to consult them.
In terms then of the process, before we come on to the process of informing people of the results, your statement suggests, although I think you didn't have access to any particular figures when you're drafting your statement, that there were, to your recollection, 65 haemophiliacs at Queen Elizabeth Hospital who were positive.
Well, that's my recollection of that, plus or minus a few. I can't. I don't have papers that specify the number.
Most of those were men with severe haemophilia A.
Not all, but yeah,
But
most.
not all. So, and I think your statement says there might have been 1 or 2 mild or moderate and maybe 2 haemophilia B patients, and you didn't think there were any von Willebrand's.
There were a couple, yeah.
And then in terms of wives or partners infected, I think you just gave us the number 4.
I think it was 4, but this is recollection from 20 odd years ago.
And then your statement says that the process then for telling patients, and you've alluded to this already, was patients were not invited to come in for a special appointment.
No, I think
They were told
weren't.
at the next routine appointment.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And your statement says that you think now that you should have seen them sooner.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how long may have elapsed in cases?
Well, unfortunately, I know one was about 4 or 5 months, maybe. The result was 5 or 6 weeks coming back. The person then came to clinic in maybe 2 or 3 weeks after that, and for some reason doesn't appear to have been told then, and was then given a routine 3-month appointment, came back at that one, and then was told. So there was clearly, again, we don't have the notes on that. I don't know why that opportunity was missed. I'd be very surprised if the person involved, because I remember who it was, would have refused the result and said, I don't want to hear it. I don't think that would have happened. So I've no idea really why that opportunity was missed.
Obviously, not telling patients until their routine appointment gives rise to the risk that in the intervening period they may infect others, in particular those with whom they're physically intimate. Why didn't you and Dr. Hill arrange for special appointments?
I don't know the answer to that. I did say in Archer, and I do remember that we were sort of kind of, I certainly was, I can't speak for Frank Hill, overwhelmed by the numbers of cases and the workload, really. I mean, to actually get someone to tell them, I mean, I was well trained and very well used to giving bad news from my leukemia practice and bone marrow transplant practice. I didn't have a problem with telling people. It's not a great thing to do, but it's an important thing to do. So I think it must have just been workload. We only had 1 clinic a week, but I suppose one could have found a room somewhere to see people outside that, but we didn't do that. So I wish we had, but we didn't. With regard to the public health risk, we did write out to people in response to the AIDS advice document. Dr. Hill drafted the letter, but it was on both our behalves, advising all of the men that they should use a barrier method of contraception and that there was a risk that they could be infected. It's not really an acceptable excuse, but I would also add that later in 85, when they were talking about bringing in blood donor screening for HTLV3, which didn't actually happen until I think October 85, there was unbelievably discussion that those donors who were positive might not be told.
Yes.
That would certainly be a public health risk. It doesn't absolve me of that responsibility, but we did write to people. But, did everybody read letters? And I don't know.
There would therefore, for some patients, have been a period of time where the hospital knew they were HTLV positive, but the patient did not. Do you know whether in that period of time there was any practice at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, your clinic, of writing to GPs to give that information to the GP prior to the patient getting it?
My recollection was that we asked the patients who were positive whether they wished us to share that result with the GP. That's my recollection. I think most of them were accepting of that. I can't remember whether there were any who always declined to have that. So no, I don't believe we were writing, those results didn't go anywhere else other than in the patient record until the patient was told.
Would those results have been more generally available within the hospital? I'm thinking, for example, if a patient came into accident and emergency, would the doctors treating that patient in accident and emergency have had access to the fact that the patient was HTLV3 positive?
Well, it was, I can't expect you to know, and I'm trying to be awkward, but the Queen Elizabeth Hospital didn't have an A&E.
Okay.
So the patients were all new to attend directly to Ward East 4B, which is where the treatment room was and where the resident doctor would have been able to see them initially. That doctor would, in the notes, have had access to that result. How often did it happen that the person was there, came up to hospital and wasn't told? Well, that would have happened. But it wasn't widely available, the result. I mean, we were very careful about confidentiality, and we had a big problem with identifying the samples. And we took the decision, rather than identifying samples as being HTLV positive, was that all samples taken from the haemophilia clinic, from whomever it was, were labelled as high risk. And looking back, we now know they were nearly all hepatitis C positive as well. That hadn't been happening before that. So it was the right decision, but it was the best we could do to try to protect people's confidentiality.
When the patients did come for their routine appointment and received their results, you said in your statement that there wasn't time necessarily to see patients for as long or as often thereafter as you would have wished to because of resource implications. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, when they were told, that would probably have taken at least half an hour, maybe longer. But we didn't have a counsellor, so we weren't able to offer a sort of series of counselling opportunities. And as I think I've said before, my description of what I did for patients was to be hopefully a caring physician who was explaining what we were doing. But I see counselling as something that's sort of a non-directive process which enables people to come to terms with difficulties. I didn't have training to do that, and I didn't have the time to do that either.
Did you... you'd have known that patients were going to be receiving, or some patients were going to be receiving very bad news, that the test result had been positive.
Well, yeah, go.
For those patients who were tested positive. Was there any suggestion to patients that they should attend with a family member or partner for support?
No, I don't think so, because I was aware that didn't happen sometimes. And in fact, most of the time, the men would come on their own.
For those patients who may have missed appointments, didn't attend, do you know whether there was any systematic attempt to follow them up, whether through their GP or otherwise?
Well, we knew who they were. They were mainly younger men. I used the word chaotic lives in my Archer thing. I rather regret that, because I think basically they were young guys trying to get on with their life. They felt fit and healthy, but in the end, we did have to. I can't remember exactly how. Some of it was done if they came up to the ward. We got a system where the nurse would contact me, and I would hot-foot it up there. That wasn't our planned approach, but eventually, by the time you got sort of into late summer, autumn, and we hadn't tested everybody, that became pretty well necessary to do. Sorry, they'd had the test, been told about that, and I think we must have done some tests on the ward, because some of these men never came to clinic.
And there was no practice, as I understand your evidence, at Queen Elizabeth of seeing patients in any kind of group session to break the news to them?
Well, to be honest, it never occurred to me. And when I heard that had happened elsewhere, I was quite, surprised, to say the least.
And then your statement suggests that in terms of the information that was provided to patients with the initial diagnosis, the impression your evidence gives is that there wasn't necessarily very much information you were able to impart at that time. Is that correct?
Well, it was clearly bad news. There were lots of comments about being negative didn't mean you couldn't be infected, but I think that, I'm not sure that ever really came about. But so being negative was good news, for as long as it was the case. It was clearly not. It was clearly bad news to be HTLV3 positive, but I think it wasn't clear that the condition was going to be so universally progressive. No. So I think there was a sense of reassurance that later on turned out to be inappropriate, really.
Your evidence and some of the documents that the inquiry has located suggest that there was a real concern about lack of resources for social work support, nursing support and the like. Is that right?
Definitely, yeah.
We'll just look at a couple of documents to illustrate that. Henry, could we have UBFT 40252, please? This is a paper, The Need for Additional Resources Within the Central Birmingham Health Authority, and it's co-authored by you and Professor Hill in April of 1986. If we go to the bottom paragraph on this page, please, Henry. We can pick it up the last 6 or so lines. Of this population, so this is the Queen Elizabeth's population, 56 are known to be positive for antibodies to HTLV3 virus and have clearly been exposed to the causative agent of AIDS. Because some patients are continuing to become positive, having been initially found to be negative. All haemophiliacs are now considered to be high-risk cases. Can you recall what that refers to? Patients having been initially found to be negative, but then positive?
It does mention both hospitals, so I wonder whether that's the cases with the armour heat treated.
And then over the page, you explain that one patient has died of AIDS, one is suspected of having AIDS, approximately 4 or 5 other patients are suffering from AIDS-related syndromes. And then, if we skip down a few lines, you say that clearly those patients who are positive for antibodies will need increased and more detailed follow-up and counselling. Duration of clinics and visits to the haemophilia unit on East 4B have increased significantly. Those haemophiliacs who were hoping to start or increase their family have been advised not to have children at the present time because of the risk of intrauterine spread of the virus. This has caused very considerable anguish and increased counselling time. Young male haemophiliacs who are sexually active but unmarried have also required detailed and in-depth counselling with regard to their future behaviour. So just pausing there, Professor Franklin, there are other documents, including, I think, some of the meeting minutes that refer to this issue, but the view was taken, as I understand it, that patients should be advised not to have children.
At that time?
At that time.
I mean, not permanently. I think the idea was that we didn't know how infectious the condition was between sexual partners and also from mother to child. So, and in fact, that became apparent, and that was a significant risk.
And then if we go on to the next page, Henry, sorry. We can see you say in the second paragraph, the problems that exist at present and are likely to continue for the next few years have so far not been recognised sufficiently at national or certainly not at regional level. A report of the regional management team regarding AIDS makes only scant mention of haemophilia, does not comment on the need for increased resources. Because of this, it's been felt necessary to approach the District Health Authority with regard to seeing what improvements can be made in the short term, since staff and capital support requested under RCDRS has been deferred for beyond 5 years. And then you set out a number of areas in which there's a need for increased funding and support. We can see there's a reference there to the need for support to the dental department at C, at F, the need for additional social work support or a counsellor. And that it's set out in more detail in the report. Can you recall what kind of reception your requests for additional funding and resources got and how successful they were?
Well, it was really depressingly unsuccessful, really. We didn't get much support from local colleagues in the hospital. I mean, basically, there was an element of the regional funding of haemophilia through the regional Factor 8 contract that you've been describing. So we did have links with the regional health authority, but this already suggests that we've not got anywhere with them, although there's no paperwork, I don't think. But I don't think this was our first attempt to get money. Locally, in the hospital, you normally had to go through them to get your bids prioritised. That was all a bit grisly. Not much support from colleagues who, frankly, I thought should have known better. Not haematology colleagues, I'm not general senior consultants. So it was really, and I think this was from people like myself and Frank who were used to the system, and he said work the system, but we didn't work this one very well. But you know, I was used to getting funds for bone marrow transplants and things like that, so I knew who to talk to, but this just didn't seem to be working. In fact, I'm cynical enough. We did eventually get some support a year or so later, but I'm cynical enough to think we probably only started getting that because of the AIDS Control Act came in. And the AIDS Control Act was going to require certainly regional health authorities to describe what they were doing to provide support for people with AIDS. And I can only assume that the regional health authority didn't want to say they hadn't done anything, so we got a counsellor and a bit else. But we got far less than this.
I think we'll just look at one further document. It's UBFT 40159. This is a joint letter from you and Professor Hill, late November 86, 24th of November 86, to Edwina Curry MP, in response, I think, to an issue that she had raised about a particular constituent, is how it reads. And you say in terms in the first paragraph, we would like to acquaint you with our difficulties in providing counselling support, and then you set out some figures in terms of those affected. And then you say the staff that we have on these units to treat the medical aspects of the haemophilia before the advent of AIDS were stretched. Despite this, we've tried to provide as much advice and counselling as possible to our patients and their relatives. These demands have and are continuing to increase as the patients and their families become increasingly aware of the consequences of the AIDS virus infection. The time available for counselling, we admit, is totally inadequate, and we are constantly aware of our inability to adequately follow up patients in this regard. As some leave the clinic, we are concerned for their safety because of the emotional stress that such uncertainty creates. With the current high level of media cover, the demands that remain unfilled are even larger. And if we go to the next page, in the second paragraph, reference is made to deaths from AIDS, and then you say, and reference to the 3 children having developed HIV despite being on heat-treated products. And you say all of these events have naturally increased the anxiety of our patients and their relatives. While we will continue to try to provide the optimal care with available staff resources, we know that this will be inadequate and we may even fail to provide for some. And then you enclose a copy of a submission, may or may not have been the document we've just looked at. And then the next paragraph, you say, although the West Midlands has 10% of the country's population and a similar proportion of the country's haemophiliacs, we did not receive any of the recent DHSS allocation of funds to haemophilia centres, because Birmingham is not a designated reference haemophilia centre, although we provide services commensurate with that status. I think there's a particular issue you raised in your statement about the funding, the DHSS funding. There was funding provided by the DHSS to reference centres for some form of counselling. Birmingham didn't get that because it didn't have the status of a reference centre. Your statement alludes to you having later discovered that there'd been some money that was sent back by the Regional Health Authority?
Yes, I mean, it's, well, it's more than depressing. I mean, it's, this sort of adds to the tragedy. The money for the counselling to the reference centres was modest, but even though it was modest, it means that, you know, we know where the reference centres were. So that meant Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds had nothing. Sorry. Yes, then I heard about the on the TV that the West Midlands had money centrally from government and had sent it back.
And I think you know no more about that than what you've described in your statement. You tried to find out.
Well, I think it related, I have done a bit more research, I think it related to a National Audit Office review of what had happened to the money from the Department of Health for AIDS. And one of the, some of the areas had really not spent much of the money at all, and that didn't really seem to bear any relation to the problem with HIV/AIDS in those particular areas. So the chairman of the West Midlands Regional Health Authority was called up to, I think it was it was on television, very late at night, a parliamentary subcommittee, probably the audit committee, to account for this, and got a very rough time. Well, he got a very rough time, but we still didn't get the money. And Frank and I didn't need the money. The patients needed the money. It was very sad. I mean, it got worse. It was worse, actually. Because when AZT came in, and I know that's a little bit controversial for some, but as I mentioned in my statement, it remains an important drug, and it's still on the WHO list of essential medicines. When that came in, we had difficulty prescribing that because it was perceived to be expensive. So you had this group of people who'd been infected by their treatment, who were then being denied treatment for the disease that they'd acquired. And the same thing then happened with hepatitis C treatment.
And I think after, well, I'll come on to the position in relation to hepatitis C in a few minutes, but I think that, there was an inquest in late 1986 at which
I went to that,
which you gave evidence, and we've got some documentation in the bundle of materials in relation to that. Following which the coroner, so we'll look at this. I think, let's find the letter. It's, I think, UBFT 1. No, I've written that down wrong. Excuse me for a moment. Yeah, I'll put an extra one in. Thanks. Yep, UBFT 40161. This is a letter dated the 23rd of December 1986. If we go to the next page, please, Henry. And it's from the Birmingham and Solihull coroner to the Chief Medical Officer of the Regional Health Authority. If we go further down, it talks about having held an inquest following the death of a 30-year-old haemophilia patient at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital on June of this year. And And then we can see to the third paragraph, Dr. Franklin tells me there are no additional resources for counselling those persons. I stated at the end of the inquest I'd be writing to you, suggesting that in some way facilities and staff should be provided to assist Dr. Franklin and his colleagues in providing an adequate counselling and care scheme for these unfortunate individuals. And you followed that up. If we look at...
yes, I wrote to the regional medical officer.
Yeah. UBFT 40232. On the 7th of January, you wrote to the regional medical officer, and in the second paragraph you say this: I'm sure you're aware we remain unable to serve the requirements of the haemophiliac population with regard to their AIDS infection. At Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the epidemic continues. We now have an additional AIDS patient on our books. A further patient is currently in hospital under investigation. Therefore, our current experience is that the number of patients who will eventually suffer from AIDS is going to be substantial. In addition, we remain incapable because of lack of resources to progressively counsel our young sexually active haemophiliacs. Next paragraph. You say, I remain very concerned that there still appears to be so little progress in getting facilities for these patients. You did, I think, eventually get funding in the course of 1987 for a social worker.
Yeah, we got, I think we may have got an extra nurse, I'm not sure. We definitely had a social worker who was excellent, but even that was, excellent but insufficient. Yeah, did help.
And then in terms of the arrangements for the care of the HIV-positive patients, do I correctly understand your statement that the haemophiliac patients were not referred to the infectious diseases clinic at East Birmingham Hospital? Their HIV care was undertaken by you and your colleagues at the Haemophilia Centre. Yeah. And why was that?
Well, I think there was no haemophilia care or centre at East Birmingham. So had the men gone there, the care would have been split between their bleeding and the HIV issue. At the time when we considered that, the infectious disease unit at East Birmingham didn't have any HIV positive patients. The Birmingham was a slightly strange place in a way at that time. I think I got this from a counsellor, a gay man who was a counsellor, and I went on the course to learn this, and he said, well, most gay men who are out in Birmingham go to London. That's what was told to me. So there wasn't a lot of HTLV positivity there. So we felt they didn't have, it wasn't as if we were sending men to a unit with experience, and they would have needed to come to us for the bleeding problems. And not only that, the distance between, as the crow flies, not much distance between East Birmingham Hospital and the Queen Elizabeth, but actually it was a sort of 35, 40-minute drive across the city. So it wasn't an easy thing for them to then go and have clinic appointments there. I mean, looking back, they might have got more funding. I think Frank and I had the skills to look after the immune deficiency because we had the skills to look after immune deficient patients having bone marrow transplants. So I don't think the problem was the expertise. The problem was the resource.
Was there any consideration given, whilst during the period while you remained director, to holding some kind of joint clinic?
I don't remember there being the idea of having a joint clinic. That might have been a good idea. I don't remember joint clinics with anybody at that time. We certainly asked advice in complex cases where we couldn't work out what infections somebody might have. I mean, we were seeing, as in AIDS everywhere, we were seeing novel infections previously quite unknown. and that was helpful. So yeah, we did take advice.
So I note the time. I'm going to move on to ask Professor Franklin some questions about hepatitis C. So is this a convenient point at which to take the break?
Yes, it is. Well, shall we come back at 12:05?
Thank you, sir.
12:05.